We don't know what our debt is. We are very quick to sign debt contracts. हमारे बच्चों को फंसा के फिर बाद में आप लोग हमें बड़ी लंबी तमहीद पढ़ा देते हैं कि भाई ये भी करना पड़ेगा, ये भी करना पड़ेगा. ये चाइल्ड अब्यूज है डेट. क्या ख्याल है आपका इसके बारे में?
The fund cannot restrain or prevent a sovereign from exercising its right to borrow. It requires reforms that really enable the private sector to mushroom and grow. The incumbent governments are often never keen to do this, so they gamble for resurrection and delay recognizing the problem of unsustainable debt, which can then make the problem deeper, more costly for the country. If you have reached a point where the restructuring is inevitable, you don't want to delay it any longer, because if you delay it, then it will become even more costly.
It is the IMF who has forced us to devalue the currency as well as keep our interest rate at such a high level that has created serious debt crisis. These two policies that we have pursued in the last 5 years added $148 billion cost to Pakistan.
सब्जेक्ट आ रहा है. अभी तक तो आसान काम हो रहा था, अब मुश्किल काम होने वाला है. तो आप ज़रा जाग जाएं और ख़ास तौर पे स्टूडेंट्स जाग जाएं, समझने की कोशिश करें. इस वक्त बहुत मुश्किल सब्जेक्ट आने वाला है, पर हमारे लिए बहुत ज़रूरी सब्जेक्ट आने वाला है. मेरे दोस्त सैयद अली अब्बास साहब IMF में काम करते हैं, माशाल्लाह बड़ा सक्सेसफुल हो गए हैं. इज़ डूइंग वेरी वेल. सैयद अली अब्बास साहब ने एक किताब रिसेंटली एडिट की है, कॉन्फ्रेंस वॉल्यूम, बड़ी अच्छी किताब है इनकी किताब है सॉवरेन डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग की. कल अशफाक साहब ने भी इस पे बात की थी और लोगों ने भी बात की थी, और हमारे मीडिया में रोज़ आता है कि हमें डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग चाहिए. तो मैंने अली से ख़ास रिक्वेस्ट की है, डॉक्टर साहब ने बहुत इस पे काम किया हुआ है, इनसे ख़ास रिक्वेस्ट की है कि ये आके हमें प्लीज़ बताएं कि सॉवरेन डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग क्या होती है, कैसे होती है, पाकिस्तान कैसे इससे बेनिफिट कर सकता है. पूरा प्रोसेस आपको समझाएंगे. जैसे मैंने आपको कहा है कि ये सब्जेक्ट ज़रा मुश्किल है, तो ज़रा ध्यान दीजिएगा. तो अली अब्बास साहब, मैंने कहा ना, ये बहुत अच्छे इकोनॉमिस्ट हैं माशाल्लाह. He's been in the fund for the last, I think, 20 years almost, and he's done very well. He's a very successful guy. You might even see him as a finance minister at some point in the future. This is the future of Pakistan. Ali, with those comments, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Dr. Saab, it's a pleasure to be here again, and thank you for inviting me. This work that was put out in the form of a book, Sovereign Debt, A Guide for Economists and Practitioners, was inspired by work I've done both as a PhD student. I wrote 3 essays on government financing when I was at Oxford. I also worked in the Tanzanian Treasury in the debt section as an ODI fellow when I was very young, and then I was involved in the 2001 Paris Club Agreement that Pakistan, was given. Javed Sadiq Malik used to be the Secretary of Finance at that time. So I have been involved in these matters for a long time, and then in the fund also I was at the Fiscal Affairs Department, and then in the department which deals with restructurings. So this was the idea was inspired by that experience, and then I reached out to Ken Rogoff, who is one of the world's leading academics on sovereign debt, and one of my other colleagues, and we put this together in 2019 with an updated post-COVID edition that came out in 2021. Contrary to what you had indicated in your opening remarks, I will be talking about the book. We will touch upon sovereign debt restructuring towards the end, but I think it is important to understand the genesis of debt and the full cycle of debt before zooming in on what can we do to resolve it. Because if you resolve the problem without understanding its roots, it will just recur. This book is about as I said, it's about the circle of debt. This is not my words. This is when we first presented it. One of the World Bank colleagues said that it talks about how and why debt is created, the birth of debt, how debt should be managed in a safe and sustainable manner, so rules for healthy living, how debt default, death should be resolved in an orderly fashion to provide resurrection. So you can understand this book provides guidance for the ultimate search for living eternally with debt. Nobody likes debt, so ideally we would want to live without it, but the truth is that debt has its function, and therefore it is important to know how to live with debt sustainably. So the book combines accessible contributions from over 30 of the world's leading experts in sovereign debt, and it covers the full range of sovereign debt issues from debt concepts to debt buildups, debt sustainability to debt management, and debt reduction to sovereign default. The book, it says it's a guide for economists and practitioners. I would say when we were writing or putting, I'm an editor of the book, but when we were putting the concept for this together, we were really interested in putting out something that is technical, but not so technical that a minister of finance would not be able to, follow it. So we did get feedback from some ministers of finance, the German finance minister, who is now the Chancellor, the Dutch, and other policymakers. But also we got feedback from some of the leading academics. Atif is mentioned here, and also some lawyers, because sovereign debt restructuring involves a good bit of law. So this is as I said earlier, this is about the cycle of debt, or the circle of debt. So the book has 9 chapters, starts with public debt through the ages, which is a historical overview, then concepts, definitions, and composition of debt, the motive to borrow, why do governments borrow, then public debt sustainability, how to keep debt sustainable, how to measure sustainable debt, debt management, reducing debt short of default, sovereign default, the debt restructuring process, and then challenges ahead. And the way I will do it is I will spend 1 slide per chapter just to give you the main points from that chapter. And by the way, Dr. Saab, in the spirit of collaboration with students and young academics and even policymakers, if there was the need to connect with me on some aspect, some technical aspect, I'm very happy to be connected. Iftikhar can do that. So chapter 1, public debt through the ages. This chapter provides a history of sovereign debt from the Middle Ages to the global financial crisis. The first sovereign debt contracts we see in Europe about 800 years ago. And at that time, the main purpose of these sovereign debt transactions was to finance wars. And it did not make sense to sort of take debt from your own citizens for that. So you can see, the British, the UK king, the English monarch borrowing from the Netherlands to fight France, etc. As the role of trust and institutions expanded and these things developed, the market for such debt also expanded. Initially external debt only, but then also domestic debt. And eventually we found that governments increasingly borrowed to finance infrastructure and also current spending, and not just wars. Now this chart here on the right shows the path of debt in both advanced economies, which is the blue line, and emerging market economies, the red line, since 1880 to 2021. And you can see the big peaks around the First World War, which is the first set of, first bar that you see. The second one is Second World War, is the big peak there. And then in the middle also there is a peak around the Great Depression. And then you can see a steady build-up from the 1970s, which for advanced economies is really the story of the expanding welfare state, with more entitlements being given to perhaps increasingly aging populations and more demand for government services. But for emerging markets, it's really a story more about shocks and shocks causing debt to rise. In advanced economies also, you see the blue line, you see a big spike after the global financial crisis and then during COVID. And this chapter very nicely disaggregates both the upturns and the downturns in debt, breaking it down by how much of it was, the plummeting of growth, how much of it was interest rates, how much was primary deficits, and is useful in that regard. So chapter 2 is about concepts, definitions, and composition, and it focuses on the large variation in definitions that we see across countries. In the fund, we normally use the general government debt concept, which means that the debt of the central government and the local governments is combined. This combination, the correct word is consolidated, which means that if there are, if the central government has claims on the local governments or vice versa, they get netted out in this consolidation, and we take the whole system as one. In some countries, this definition of debt or the institutional definition also includes public sector enterprises. The fund's approach for market access countries is that if a public sector enterprise is standalone, healthy, viable, then they need not be part of the general government debt perimeter. But if the enterprise is not viable, as we see many state-owned enterprises in Pakistan can be, then they have to be consolidated within the government sector, general government sector. There is also the issue of public guarantees, whether they should be part of the definition of debt. The fund takes these as contingent liabilities unless there is a clear sense that these will be called. There are other types of issues around swap lines from China, central bank swap lines, and deposits from other countries at the central bank. The recent guidance on these is that it is likely that these should be included as sovereign debt, and I believe that in Pakistan the definition of debt includes them, even though they reside at the central bank and not the finance ministry. A big issue in advanced economies is the social security obligations in these countries. They are aging, and there are health and social security commitments that they have made to their populations. And if you include them, the estimates of debt can become very large. So in the US, debt could be $20 trillion or $75 trillion, depending on whether you include social security contributions or not. And those are very large numbers. In the book, there is a good analysis of the full sovereign balance sheet. So not just looking at liabilities, but also looking at the asset side. And here you can see in this chart, countries sorted by their net worth. And as you sort of move from the left of the chart to the right of the chart, countries grow in net worth. One country I would like to point out is in sort of toward from the left, if you start, is the very big bar that you see. That's Japan. So Japan has one of the largest debt to GDP ratios in the world, about 250% of GDP. And you can see that in the bar that goes below the axis. But Japan also has huge financial assets and non-financial assets, which means that their net worth is actually close to zero. Whereas if you look at, the UK, the country I'm currently working on, they don't have as large gross debt to GDP as Japan, but they do not have similarly sized financial and non-financial assets, so their net worth is actually negative. Pakistan is not on this list, but I think this approach is now well defined in our fiscal affairs department, and if there was interest, one can put them in touch with somebody who could do this analysis for Pakistan as well. This chapter also talks about different types of debt holders, non-residents, which can be divided into the official sector and the private sector, and then resident debt holders, which is in three categories: central bank, banks, and non-banks, and some nice charts on how these shares have evolved through time. It also talks about different approaches to defining domestic debt. One criterion is residency, whether the holder is resident in the country or non-resident. The other is currency, local versus foreign. And the third is legal jurisdiction, that if the debt had to be restructured, which law would be applicable to it, domestic law or foreign law. And in Pakistan's case, most of our debt, external debt, which is by residency or by currency, is also under foreign law, either New York law or English law. But you have, India or China, you would find most of their debt is domestic, including in terms of legal jurisdiction. So this chapter is about the motive to borrow, and it takes a step back to looking at why sovereigns need to borrow in the first place. Of course, sovereigns can tax their citizens, so it is a first-order question of why they borrow. And the reasons have been divided into good and bad in this chapter. The good reasons for borrowing are to smooth out the tax increases that might be required when the economy tanks or goes down. In that case, in order to balance the government's books, the kinds of tax increases that would be required would be distortionary and would further slow the economy. So it makes sense to avoid large changes in tax rates and keep things smooth on that front. And this is the tax smoothing rationale. The other one is more general, that you act in a counter-cyclical way. When the economy is in recession, fiscal policy should be supportive. And when the economy is booming, fiscal policy can try to slow economic growth. And this is also not sort of to keep the boom-bust cycles muted because they can create issues. There is also the motive to finance human and physical capital, and the borrowing also, debt also serves as a safe asset. As you know, the government bond yield, the 10-year bond yield in the US is the basis, the pricing benchmark for a lot of lending that happens in the economy, and the same in other countries. In Pakistan, it would be treasury bill rates and treasury bond rates that serve such a purpose. And the bad reasons that are mentioned in this chapter include political cycles or electoral cycles that, just before an election, spending would rise in order to, make the population happier. Of course, that saddles the country with more debt than is optimal. But, this is very common in emerging market economies, and I suspect Pakistan would be no exception. Sometimes higher borrowing is also done to limit the successor government spending options if it is felt in a democracy that the next government would be from a different party, that the incumbent would lose. The other bad reason is intergenerational transfer, that you simply, because when you borrow, it has to be paid off, or you need to raise taxes in the future to service that debt. It's easy, myopic, but easier to push it out to your children and grandchildren, and say, well, they will pay the taxes to service the debt. We can just consume more today. And then there is the common pool problem, in that everybody wants, sort of within a system where everybody is jostling for their own projects and influence, they all want the government to borrow and fund their projects, but nobody really pays attention to the cost of that borrowing that has to be shouldered by the economy. This chapter looks at the difference in the net cost of debt or the burden of debt depending on motive. If debt were to finance quality investment, then the R minus G impact, which is the interest rate net of the growth rate impact, is more favorable than if this debt simply finances, luxury consumption by the government. The chapter also discusses ways to limit over borrowing. Fiscal rules and councils are helpful in this regard. Many countries institute these, but the degree to which they are adhered to varies a lot. In some countries, fiscal rules are cast in constitutional limit terms. Poland is an example where the debt cannot be more than 50% of GDP. And that's the constitutional limit, 50%, I think. And then, so if you hit 40%, then that triggers some actions. In Pakistan too, I think we've had FRD, FDRL, which is about limiting the fiscal spend to ensure that debt doesn't rise above a certain level. But it can become difficult to sustain these in the face of shock. So it's important to think about escape clauses and to ensure that the rule is sort of kicks in early enough in the process. So spending-based fiscal rules have become quite popular lately. And fiscal councils have emerged as institutions that opine on fiscal policy, on how well the government is doing. I work on the UK, and there the Office for Budget Responsibility is a very, I would say, powerful fiscal council in that they are the ones that produce the macroeconomic and fiscal forecast, and the government is obliged to use it. The government does not produce its own economic forecast, and often through the forecast, projections can be shown that paint a rosy picture, when in fact, if you took an objective view of future growth, interest rates, primary deficits, it would be a more sobering picture. So,
Ali, can you please describe how fiscal council works? I don't think people in Pakistan know that.
So, fiscal council is an independent body of experts. Fiscal experts could draw on academics, could draw on former people who worked in government, and these councils opine regularly on government fiscal decisions, especially the budget. And the idea is that the council's commentary on these fiscal events can be a way of disciplining the government to adhere to prudent and sensible fiscal choices, rather than do what they want. In many countries, the council's role is defined to be exactly that they comment and opine on the government's fiscal decisions, and these get a lot of press attention, and then the governments are also obliged to respond formally to the opinion of the fiscal council. Of course, they are not very popular in regimes or in systems which are more authoritarian minded. This is more to ensure that decisions remain sensible and in line with good economic reasoning. But as I said, in the UK, the Office for Budget Responsibility is empowered also to produce the forecast, the economic forecast. So that power is taken from the government there. Anyways, we can talk more later on this. This chapter also looks at the debt overhang problem, that if your debt becomes above a certain level, then the government's ability to act in a counter-cyclical manner, that is, fiscal policy being supportive in the face of an adverse shock, that capacity weakens. And that is the reason, the result is that recessions and crises can be deeper because the government can't support And the government can't support because if your debt is too high, the debt sustainability concerns become binding. Markets will not lend to a government with higher debt. And thus, if you do not want your debt to rise to a level where it constrains countercyclical fiscal policy. So this chapter is about public debt sustainability, and it considers 4 challenges that arise in approaching debt sustainability. The first is, how do you define the concept? And ultimately, and this is also the approach broadly taken by the fund, it boils down to whether the debt to GDP ratio can be stabilized in the future, say over a 5-year horizon, with feasible future primary surpluses. Feasible here encapsulates both political and economic feasibility. So if a government has high debt, and it says, we will raise taxes in the future, but those tax increases are so large that nobody thinks politically the government would get away with it, then one could say that this situation is of an unsustainable debt position. And when you are in an unsustainable debt position, then you need to restructure your debt, renegotiate the terms, etc. The fund also pays attention to, in thinking about sustainability, to financing pressures and needs. And that if financing risks grow very large, then even if your debt is low, the risk around that debt becomes very large, because a large part of your debt can quickly get repriced if interest rates are adverse, or you might not even be able to roll over your debt, which can also lead the debt to become unsustainable. The second bit in the chapter is quantifying credibility, which is what are the limits on the promises that governments can make on future primary surpluses to sort of not pay off the debt, but to continue to service the debt. And there's a large literature by Jonathan Ostry and others in the fund on debt limits. And in many cases, these debt limits for emerging markets are in the 80 to 90% range. They can go higher in some cases. It depends on the track record that these countries have of fiscal discipline and being able to consolidate fiscally in the past, the strength of their institutions, etc. That's the second bit in understanding whether debt is sustainable or not, what the debt limit for the country might be. The third is modeling uncertainty. And you can see this is a debt fan chart for Portugal, debt to GDP ratio, which starts at 100%, but it has an upward skew in terms of the probabilistic outcomes that this debt can take in the next 6 years. And this is important for countries which are subject to large shocks, especially commodity price shocks. If they can have a big impact on fiscal outcomes, then these types of fan chart approaches move the focus from a point estimate, which doesn't really mean much, to a probabilistic picture, which then throws, okay, what's the probability of debt staying below 70% in 5 years' time? And that's a very different kind of conversation. And the fund's new sovereign risk and debt sustainability framework, which I was involved in the development of, does take a probabilistic approach now. So it's all about probabilities of debt stabilization, etc. Incorporating liquidity, and I mentioned this earlier, it's very difficult sometimes to disentangle liquidity problems from solvency models of sovereign debt crises, which is why the fund does pay attention to financing needs. And as we will discuss in the next slide, a lot of debt management, good debt management, is to ensure that these liquidity stresses do not emerge or accentuate. The chapter, discusses the IMF's debt sustainability framework, which is focused on the debt to GDP ratio and gross financing needs. Those people who are not familiar with the gross financing needs concept, this is simply the sum of the government's fiscal deficit and the amount of principal that is maturing in the next year. So if Pakistan's fiscal deficit was, say, 6% of GDP and 10% of GDP in debt, domestic and external combined, in principal terms was maturing, then the gross financing needs would be 6% plus 10%, 16% of GDP. And in the past, the fund had an indicative limit of 15% of GDP for emerging markets. We've moved away from that now, and the focus is much more on how much of this need, this financing need, can be met from the local banking system if you ended up in a situation where foreign creditors could not finance or the market could not finance. To what extent could you turn to banks to be the residual financier? And their country's capacity differs a lot depending on how large and healthy their banking systems are. This is about debt management, and it talks about the objectives of debt management from both the perspective of the portfolio manager, but also the national policymaker. And I think this is the important contribution of this chapter. That, I mean, if you look at what a debt management office does, it's basically, what a fund manager would do. It would try to, look at certain types of risks in the portfolio. But that narrow perspective may not be optimal when you're looking at debt from a country-wide perspective. So a national policymaker will care about the cost-risk trade-off narrowly for the government of its debt portfolio, but it would also look at what might be optimal for the sovereign may not be optimal for its holders. So if a government suddenly starts issuing long-term bonds and forces the banks to hold them, then it would be pushing out duration risk or the interest rate risk on those bonds to the banks. And this can mean that the banks become more vulnerable. And later, if the banks go down, then the government will have to, may need to bail them out. Similarly, we had the situation when a lot of advanced economies were doing quantitative easing, in that the central bank was trying to purchase long-term government bonds in the market, but at the same time, you had some debt management offices issuing more longer-term paper, and that was offsetting the benefit of what the central bank was trying to do, which was to lower the yields on longer-term paper. So a national policymaker has to take a much broader view of debt management than a simple, a narrow debt manager does. Also, it's important that debt management offices can't mitigate all the risks. Sound macro fiscal policies are essential to the work of debt management offices. And if there isn't that soundness in place, the DMO's degrees of freedom to avert funding crisis is much less. So you can I don't know what analogy to give, but if you're trying to protect your government from broader problems, you cannot do it if the underlying health of the government is not good, or if the operating environment within which that government operates is risky, subject to a lot of shocks with no buffers. Then it's very difficult for DMOs to achieve anything. Still, the chapter goes on to present the key portfolio risks for DMOs, which is currency risk, refinancing risk, and interest rate risk. A lot of importance given to debt sustainability and contingent liabilities, and also a recognition that if the debt manager does do its job well in good times, for example, in the UK, their average maturity of debt is 14 years, which means that 1 over 14, a very small fraction of debt matures every year. So the fiscal deficit obviously has to be financed in the market, but the burden from maturing debt is quite small. Whereas in many emerging markets, and I believe in Pakistan too, this average maturity might be much shorter. The chapter also talks about domestic debt, why it can be a problem. Often countries want to issue more domestic debt because they think they can control it better than external debt. And clearly the economies within the emerging market space and most advanced economies only have domestic debt. But in many emerging economies, if the domestic debt burden becomes very large and becomes unserviceable, then it's very hard to resolve that problem because the government needs to inflict pain on its own residents if it were to sort of restructure the debt. Restructure is maybe a strong word, but even if it wanted to have some reprofiling, some operation done that would reduce the burden of debt, you would be inflicting some pain on your own citizens. There's a big section on what is required for well-functioning local currency bond markets, and the things that are emphasized there are a sound institutional setup, which transparency of auctions of government securities, the predictability of them, the calendar should be announced, and that is important to build credibility with investors who can then line up the cash to bid, to place bids, and that ensures that the government can get the best price on its issuance. There is an interesting chart, which this table here, which shows the supply side risk indicators and demand side risk indicators. That supply side means how high is your debt. So there is the low debt and high debt buckets, and the demand side risk indicator is how resilient to a run is your debt. So how quickly can investors or likely investors can flee from your debt or run from your debt. And you don't want to be in a situation where both your debt is high and it is held by investors who are exiting. You want to be in a situation where ideally your debt is low, so quadrant 3, and that there is more resilience to a run. So these are sort of long-term institutional investors or concessional financing that is not at risk of leaving suddenly. So now we come to a situation where these next 3 chapters are about that, where debt has become too high and it needs to be reduced. And this first chapter is about how to reduce debt without defaulting. And the term default here is used in sort of the more general economics sense, which is that without adjusting the terms of the initial debt contract, whether that adjustment happens through a negotiated settlement or through a unilateral default resulting in arrears, is sort of, that's not the focus here. It will become important maybe later on in the other chapters, but here, so you want to reduce debt without defaulting. So debt has become too high. This, at the very top, is the debt dynamic equation, which shows that what is the change in the debt to GDP ratio in the period ahead. And that depends on 3 major factors. One is the difference between the interest rate on debt, the effective interest rate on debt, and the growth rate of the economy, multiplied by the level of the debt to GDP ratio. If R minus G is positive and large, then that factor will push the debt to GDP ratio up because you're paying more on interest, which is pushing the debt up, then you are getting growth to expand your GDP and pull the ratio down. And then the second factor is your primary balance. Obviously, if you have a large primary balance surplus, it's going to pull the debt down. If, on the other hand, you have a large primary deficit, it's going to push the debt up. I believe in Pakistan, the primary deficit is not the issue. It's mainly the R minus G, the interest rate on the interest burden of the debt is large. Then the third thing is currency depreciation into FX debt to GDP. That's the rate at which your local currency is depreciating vis-a-vis currencies in which your debt is denominated, your external debt is denominated, FX debt. And the more your currency depreciates, that burden will rise. There is also a residual, which is about shocks, like contingent liabilities being called, the government being asked to bail out a bank, recapitalize it, or a state-owned enterprise, and the injections that are needed can also add to your debt. Maybe let me correct myself on what I said about the primary balance. What I meant is that in numerical terms, many emerging markets, including Pakistan, don't have large primary balances. But that does not mean that the primary balance does not need to be larger in order to bring the debt down. That may well be the case. So I just wanted to clarify that. What is easiest, to talk about, but hardest to deliver is how to boost growth, the G in this equation, which then has benefits for your revenues, also your exports. And so it has knock-on effects on the primary balance, on the currency depreciation. Easiest to promise, very difficult to deliver, requires looking at what drives productivity in an economy and how to improve and maximize that. And a lot of countries struggle with that. It requires a strategy. It requires reforms that really enable the private sector to mushroom and grow. And often it requires the government reducing its footprint in the economy so that the private sector can take off. Fiscal adjustment, obviously, it's painful politically, but often has to be done to generate a higher primary balance if needed. There is also the possibility of inflation and financial repression, which try to lower our inflation. Financial repression is if you surprise shock an economy with high inflation. If you look at our gross public debt as a share of revenues, it's the largest we found in the world, 667%. The average is 214%. And if you look at FX public debt, foreign currency denominated public debt as a share of exports, that was also one of the largest. So we do have an issue with debt being large. Maybe it's maybe large as a percent of GDP, but the underlying factors which pay debt, which is revenues, and external debt, which is exports, if you scale it to those denominators, then it's actually pretty large. And this does then obviously, enunciate the importance of making sure that if this debt is brought down, then we don't sort of end up in this problem again. The next slide is about sovereign default, defined as sort of as in the economics terms. It studies the causes and consequences of sovereign default. Often there are factors internal to the government, but external shocks which can cause crises to become so large or protracted that they eventually lead to governments not being able to honor their original contractual commitments. Default is not easy to define. What kind of an event? Is it a missing of a payment? That's the ultimate, but also if the government is forced to go to its creditors and ask for rescheduling its claims, and even if that is done in a voluntary term, economists can also call that default. So I think the definition, perhaps a lot of attention gets focused on that, but the issue is you don't want to end up in a position where you need to renegotiate the terms of your contract. Now, in terms of, as I mentioned, why a default might occur, it looks at the role of mismanagement and misfortune, and also that markets can get pitted against a country and act in a self-fulfilling manner if they lose confidence. It explores the cost of default alongside potential policies that can mitigate it. If a country does end up restructuring its debt, it can lead to some loss of market access, period in which the government cannot borrow from the market. It can also mean that economic activity slows, so growth will be slower. So some of those costs are mentioned. On the other hand, though, if you are in an unsustainable situation and you do not address that situation through a restructuring or some renegotiation of debt in a timely manner, and often governments are reluctant to do it because of reputational reasons. They don't want to be seen as having mismanaged things or being in a situation. The incumbent governments are often never keen to do this, so they gamble for resurrection and delay recognizing the problem of unsustainable debt, which can then make the problem deeper, more costly for the country, and it makes it even more difficult to pull the country out of that. So it's a delicate balance. Clearly, there are costs of restructuring and defaulting on your debt. You want to avoid those costs, but if you have reached a point where the restructuring is inevitable, you don't want to delay it any longer, because if you delay it, then it will become even more costly. And there's this right bar which shows the IMF's approach to dealing with countries which have unsustainable debt, or debt is sustainable with high probability, or debt is sustainable but not with high probability. Those are the three buckets that we use for our exceptional access framework, which is large lending. And we require, in general, debt sustainability with high probability for our exceptional access window. But in some cases, if that is not given, then you can still lend if debt is sustainable, but not with the high probability. If there is sufficient exposure, like claims that are falling due, like debt that's falling due several years down, so that if needed, that could still be restructured later on to bring the country to sustainable with high probability. And this one is about the restructuring process. And so there's a playbook here which identifies the key protagonists. The players are the government, it's the creditors, it's the IMF, which provides the envelope of debt relief. It's also lawyers and sovereign debt advisors who come into action. A key task is sizing the debt relief envelope. Once you've determined that a restructuring is needed, you need to decide how much relief do we need from these creditors. Then there is a preparation of proposals from the government side. Then the negotiation with the creditors begins, and then there is a closing where sometimes earlier debt is exchanged, is replaced with new debt. We call these exchange bonds, and those exchange bonds have longer tenors, lower interest rates, often to give relief to the borrowing government. One key tension is you want to generate adequate debt relief so that the country doesn't need to restructure again and again. So you don't want to do too light a restructuring and just leave the country very close to the edge of unsustainability. But you also want to ensure high creditor participation, which cannot become difficult if you try to extract too much from the creditors. So it's a fine balancing act between those two. And this is what, in most the fund, the IMF needs to make and provide the sort of the amount of debt relief that's needed to sort of make sure that both sides feel the balance is struck. So the collective action clauses are a very important part of the carrots and the carrot or the stick that is used sometimes in terms of carrots. Some upfront cash is used to incentivize creditors to restructure. And then, there are some other technical details which I think would be, we can cover later on if needed. Last chapter is challenges ahead. And this is a chapter which talks about why is it difficult. It looks at why it might be harder to resolve sovereign debt crises today. And there are several reasons. One is blurred boundaries between foreign and domestic debt. You can have foreigners participate in local currency markets. That can create complications. You also have the problem of the issuer, whether the debt is issued by a state-owned enterprise or the government. So is it really a government liability or not? And often in restructuring situations, if the sovereign has declared that it cannot pay, then the state-owned enterprise often also cannot honor its obligations. The two have to be combined. And then official versus private lender. Sometimes the loans that are received from, say, China has some banks which can lend in a private capacity, so they're private lenders and not sovereign lenders, and that can create difficulties because the fora for discussing private debt resolutions or official debt resolutions are different. For official creditors, it's still the Paris Club or the Common Framework, but for private creditors, it's bondholder committees and other fora. So if it's not clear whether a particular debt is official versus private, it's not easy to then see how to, where to put that claim for resolution. And the creditor base today for countries has also become more complex. In the past, a lot of the debt, so say in 2001, Pakistan's bilateral debt was largely to Paris Club creditors. So it was easy within a couple of months, the deal was arranged. But with non-Paris Club creditors like China and Gulf countries and others, the creditor coordination problem becomes hard because these creditors are not part of the Paris Club process. And somehow they need to get together and decide how much relief to give to Pakistan or how much relief they're willing to provide. Bondholders can also be dispersed. A very large number of small bondholders rather than a few banks that hold the debt. So it's easy to negotiate with a few players, but with a very large number can be difficult. And a lot of domestic debt, which is painful to restructure, as I mentioned earlier, because you're inflicting, the haircuts or the relief, the debt relief on your own citizens. They claim to be senior and above the fray of restructuring. Foreign currency swaps between central banks are an example. Deposits that central banks, even though they're counted as debt because they are parked in the central bank, they are often said this is outside the perimeter of restructurable instruments. Collateralized debts, where debt can be held against collateral. Collateral can be held against debt. So if you default on the debt, they will just take the collateral. I think it became an issue in Sri Lanka with ports, etc. Pre-financing arrangements where you've given away your revenue streams, especially for commodity producers. This is an issue. No representative creditor groups. The London Club is no longer operative. Paris Club is now the minority creditor, as I mentioned earlier. And there are still market-based, in the market-based approach to defang holdouts among private creditors. Holdouts means people who don't want to contribute to the debt restructuring, don't want to provide debt relief. That problem is still a little bit there with weak collective action clauses and pari passu clauses in some bond contracts. So those are some reasons why it might be harder to resolve sovereign debt crises. Today, what can be done in the crisis prevention space is fiscal rules and councils to discipline countries, debt transparency, making sure that there are no debts that are hidden, and contingent liabilities are well reported. Responsible lending on the part of creditors, like international creditors, that they don't lend for strategic reasons, but lend keeping in mind the ability of the debtor to pay back. And then something I've worked on, state contingent debt, which is if debt contracts, if the burden of payment can somehow be linked to the state of the economy. So if your growth rate is stronger, you can pay more on the debt. If your growth rate is weaker, you pay less. And this is also very interesting academic area. In the crisis resolution space, there's discussion of legal remedies, sovereign immunity. That when if a lot of our external debt is in under New York law, then could there be something that could be done to, and if the sovereign announces the debt restructuring, the bondholders should not be able to go and get a court ruling that allows them to attach Pakistan's or other countries' properties abroad. If the country were to announce a restructuring, in order to avoid that, sovereign immunity legislation laws have been considered. Aggressive use of CACs, collective action clauses, coordinated creditor fora. This DSSI was a success. The debt service and suspension initiative, the common framework, is finally taking off. And there is now a global sovereign debt roundtable that has been started with the IMF, World Bank, private creditors, official creditors, to generate consensus on technical issues such as the boundary between official and private claims, and defining comparability of treatment across creditors, these types of issues. So maybe I'll stop there. It's a lot. I'm sorry I've taken longer than I expected to, but I tried to cover the full range of issues covered in the book. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. That was wonderful. I really appreciate it. That was very nice. Kind of opened up the landscape to our people here. In Pakistan, as you might know, Ali, I'm sure you keep up with the news. A, we don't know what our debt is. Two, we are very quick to sign debt contracts, swaps here and there. We like this. It's very sexy. Sounds very sexy. We can do a swap. Sounds very sexy. We can do a swap. So our finance secretaries feel very macho when they do that. Now we've got a plethora, a mess, and now everybody on TV comes along, my economist friends, and say, let's restructure, let's reprofile. They do it with a snap of the fingers. It can happen tomorrow. From what you say, it's a very difficult, complex task, and I don't think we even have the skills or the capability to restructure our debt. तो मतलब हम फंस गए एक किस्म का बहुत सख्त. तो ये कोई आप लोगों ने काम किया है कि हम कैसे अपने आप को फंसाएं ना. ये जो एक चीज़ है कि जी हम सॉवरेन डेट सोचते हैं कि एक बड़ी चीज़ है, जैसे वो लोग आ जाते हैं, भाई सड़क बना लो, पैसे ले लो. इसके ऊपर कोई आपके पास गाइडलाइंस नहीं है कि जी अच्छा हमने इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर बनाना है जनाब, चीन से ले लो. अब आपने बताया लंदन क्लब टूट गया है, पेरिस क्लब भी. चीन तो पेरिस क्लब में आता ही नहीं. ठीक है, अब हम कैसे रिस्ट्रक्चर करें, किस किस से बात करें? मल्टीलैटरल
Nadeem, are you still there?
Can you hear me? You can't hear me. Hello? No, I don't think you can hear me.
Yeah, I lost you a little bit when you were talking about the desire to borrow.
I'm saying we've got the deep desire to borrow without understanding the implications. And quite frankly, there is a problem. We had a talk with Easterly yesterday. There's a problem कि हमें सब फंसा देते हैं डेट में, फिर हम निकल नहीं सकते. तो ये जो आपका नया ग्रुप बैठा हुआ है, इस पर कोई बात कर रहा है कि हम बेचारे जो छोटे बच्चे हैं, हमारे बच्चों को फंसा के फिर बाद में आप लोग हमें बड़ी लंबी तमहीद पढ़ा देते हैं कि भाई ये भी करना पड़ेगा, ये भी करना पड़ेगा. तो ये जो नई कमेटी IMF ने बनाई है, कोई बच्चों का भी ख्याल करें. ये चाइल्ड अब्यूज है डेट, क्या ख्याल है आपका इसके बारे में?
So again, I can't comment on Pakistan issues, obviously, Nadeem. But
no, I'm just talking about the child abuse that the global community puts on poor countries like us.
I won't put it that way, but I think what is important is that countries develop their capacity to manage debt, to understand the trade-offs involved in borrowing, to register the cost of debt properly. I think back in the 2000s, our governments weren't even aware that when you borrow externally, the currency depreciation on that debt can make your debt repayments much harder later on, and it actually has implications for your debt to GDP ratio. So you really need a finance ministry, a debt office that has experience. Well, if they have not experienced, at least they are sharp enough to understand these trade-offs. And the literature is out there. This book itself has a lot of information. And even the fund and the bank, they offer courses.
Tell me one thing, Ali, sorry to cut you off. How does the IMF pretend to be innocent in this regard? I mean, where was the article for consultation when we were hawking ourselves off to bloody international creditors? on Sukuk bonds, on SOPs, on this, that, etc. Article 4 consultations didn't work, and even programs didn't work. So I think, in a sense, does the fund have any guidelines on this now, or does the fund still pretend to be innocent and comes in only when we are in trouble?
I think you'll have to go back to whatever documents were produced at the time, the Article 4 consultations or the post-program monitoring reports, which might have had messages on fiscal, on even real exchange or depreciation, which perhaps were not heeded, but they must have been there. I can't imagine them not being there. The thing, Nadeem, is that the fund cannot restrain or prevent a sovereign from exercising its right to borrow. And this is an issue that often comes along. We sometimes don't like a certain transaction, but we can't stop it because it's the sovereign's decision to do it.
Do remember,
so ultimately, sovereigns have to be responsible themselves.
Do remember that
and the idea,
cigarettes come with a label, keep away from children. And guns come with a label that keep away from children. So I think you should give us a label that keep away from debt. Go ahead, Ashfaq Saab. You've got some questions here. I'll turn you over to the audience.
First of all, let me thank Ali Abbas for presenting his book. Ali Abbas, my name is Dr. Ashfaq, and I have been associated with Ministry of Finance for 11 years, and I'm one of the two authors of the Fiscal Responsibility and Debt Limitation Law, which FRDL Act 2005 you have mentioned. So I'm the author of that law. I have been involved in 3 debt restructuring in Paris Club. One was flow reprofiling, and one was the stock reprofiling. I think you mentioned about our finance secretary. He was additional secretary external finance at that time. So I was involved also in this debt restructuring. So whatever you have said is fully known and understood, at least when I was in the Ministry of Finance. I don't know what has happened thereafter. I left in 2009. Things have changed drastically thereafter. But this is what I have been teaching to my student also. And in that respect, I think your book is will be very useful, not only for me, but my student as well. And I will look forward to getting this book from either from the IMF resident rep office in Islamabad, or I can buy from the fund bookstore. My very small question, when you talked about debt sustainability and you said R minus G, R is the nominal policy rate, or it is the real interest rate you're talking about?
Dr. Saab, the pleasure to take your question. I remember I even met you, I think, in 2001 or so.
Yes.
When I was there. You might not remember me. So the R and G, whatever R is, G is the same. So if R is nominal, G is nominal.
Okay.
If R is real, G is real. So you can cut it different ways. In some equations, R is presented as nominal, but then G is also nominal. So the differential doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter that much. Because, if you add inflation to R, to the real, and you add inflation to the G, they'll both just net out.
Okay. So
so it's the underlying.
Now my next question
differential.
is related to what Nadeem talked about the child abuse. We are under the IMF, and we are forced to maintain a policy rate of 22% with a real GDP growth will be 2%, right? And our nominal policy rate is about is 22%. It depends whether you're talking about the headline inflation or the core inflation.
Real interest is the negative, है ना?
नहीं, यही मैं बताना चाह रहा हूँ कि if we deal with headline inflation as we are dealing now, or the core inflation, when you take away the food and energy prices. I think in the fund they used to have the core inflation. If we say core inflation, then our real interest rate is 4% positive versus 2% our real GDP growth, then I think we have a serious debt sustainability issue. So this is what I wanted to say, that it is the IMF who has forced us to devalue the currency as well as keep our interest rate at such a high level that has created serious debt crisis. These two policies that we have pursued in the last 5 years added $148 billion cost to Pakistan. So Nadeem is rightly pointing out about the child abuse by the IMF.
Obviously, I will not comment on the characterization from Nadeem. I would probably disagree with it. I think the issue with the R minus G is that both R and G need to be, the same concept of inflation needs to be deducted from both.
Same unit.
So, if your G is 2% and your R using the same, whether it's GDP deflator is I don't know, minus 2%, then your R minus G is actually negative, not positive. So it's not adding to your debt, but it's actually subtracting from it. But again, I don't have the numbers. I would say that, also on currency depreciation, etc.
One thing, just a minute. Do you deal with headline inflation or the core inflation?
I think headline and core inflation are used primarily to assess inflationary pressures. But when we're talking about the debt to GDP dynamics, because it's debt over GDP, you need to deflate, you need to use the same deflator that applies to the interest rate as you apply to the GDP. So that difference of core, headline, etc., is not going to make a difference in terms of the differential. I hope that's clear.
Let's move on.
Ali, this is Mahmood Khalid from PIDE. Thank you very much. Two quick questions. One, do you think that the responsibility laws, like the FRDL in case of Pakistan, which was written similar to the growth and stability of the institutions like the developed countries, would work? Because you have just shown that if you look at the sustainability of the debt, that's a bigger problem, thinking just at the debt to GDP ratio. And this is the same obsession which we also see in terms of tax to GDP ratios, whereas the actual issues are somewhere else. The second quick question related to the pari passu clause. Are you suggesting, or are you saying that it needs to be built in that particular debt contract? Because I thought that it is between the debtor and creditor, that if the debtor actually can't basically pay, so this is what the creditors are surviving on. So doesn't it come into force automatically where the countries are facilitated for restructuring? Does it need to be written in that contract before we opt for it, even if the debtor can't repay? Thank you.
On the first question about these types of laws, the question is whether they bind or not. As I said, in some countries, like in Poland, they have a constitutional limit on debt. So you cannot move to a 50% level. I believe the FRDL was passed in the mid 2000s, or late 2000s, but I don't know what the compliance with that has been. And so, one, it depends on how well the country manages. When the law is introduced, where is the country's debt? And is it realistic in relation to that?
Let me make it easier.
And the second is,
we don't even respect the constitution in terms of election in 90 days. So what does the FRDL mean to us? We have we don't respect any rules whatsoever. What can we do?
So again, so it depends on whether these fiscal rules are actually bite or not. If they don't bite, then they will not help discipline fiscal policy, and the debt problems will recur. On the question of the pari passu clause, this is actually a clause that says that the country must treat all of its creditors equally, bondholders equally. And this clause is an innocent clause, but in restructuring situations, it can create problems because holdouts, those people who do not participate in the restructuring, can, after other people have agreed, they can, ask for full payment on their bonds because the new exchange bonds are being serviced fully. So it's a nefarious tool that has been used by some creditors. In Argentina's case, the pari passu clause was used by holdouts to get full payment on the debt, even as other, restructured bonds had taken big haircuts. And I don't know whether Pakistan's bonds have the latest pari passu clauses or not, but there is now an updated, enhanced pari passu clause, which the IMF itself put out for countries to use, which sort of prevents this abuse of the clause. I hope that clarifies. Thanks.
Ali, thank you very much. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate you doing this. It was a great, great session. I think we are going to now start teaching your book in our universities. I think it's a subject that we should really learn about. And whenever you're in Pakistan, you must come and give an additional lecture on what you're doing. And even from outside, Zoom has made us friendly to everybody overseas. So please stay in touch, and we'll keep calling on you again and again. Thank you very much for giving us your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saab. Thank you, everyone. Khuda Hafiz.